My guest today is Rod McGarvie. I've been looking forward to introducing Rod to you because of his valuable insights on what works and what doesn't work in issues involving multiculturalism. Rod started his working life as a carpenter and joiner before joining the Australian Army as a combat engineer. While serving our nation in the Army, Rod was part of a peacekeeping force in Namibia in southwest Africa. After his service in the Defence Force, he returned to Africa with his family where he lived and worked for 12 years, much of which was as an executive director of a not-for-profit language translation and literacy organisation in Uganda and Tanzania, leading a team of 200 international and African staff. Living and working in Africa gave Rod practical experience and helped shape his thinking around a number of the hotly contested issues Australia faces today. Issues such as refugees, immigration and foreign aid. What we really need in these conversations are voices that have seen the realities of multiculturalism and are qualified to speak to real and practical solutions, not just feel-good ideas. Rod has undertaken extensive training in regard to language, culture and sustainable cross-cultural development. He also has a Master of Business Administration. Rod's political experience is considerable and twice challenged Wayne Swan for his seat on behalf of the Coalition. The second run was frustratingly close and ultimately thwarted only by Kevin Rudd's replacement of Julia Gillard at the last minute. However, Rod left the broad tent of the Liberal Party after the Coalition betrayed their election promise to repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. In 2016, Rod stood as the lead Senate candidate for Family First in Queensland and again very narrowly lost his race, this time thanks to a resurgent Pauline Hanson. Thanks for coming on the show, Rod.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
Now, the federal election, I was actually a fellow candidate with you for Family First in that race and just pipped at the post by Pauline Hanson's second candidate in Queensland.
Yeah, they came on with a strong finish. It was a bit of a surprise, I think, to most of us, how strongly they did.
Yeah, to come 13th out of 12 available places.
Yes, always a bridesmaid, not a bride.
So, tell me about your political, I guess, disposition. Whereabouts do you sit in the spectrum?
Well, I've been interested in politics for a number of years, and I would say I'm a conservative, social conservative, and I'm probably an economic liberal, so free trade and low barriers, small government type man. And tell me how much of your experience in Africa either changed or firmed your positions on social and economic policy? Yeah, well, living in a third world country and looking at the great disparities and everything else, you get a really good insight into what works and what doesn't work. From economic areas, we're talking about foreign aid, but foreign aid has crippled a lot of countries throughout time. All it does is put money in the pockets of the politicians, wealthy businesses that are connected to politicians. So a lot of cronyism goes on, and a lot of the aid is siphoned off and disappears, doesn't get to the people it's meant to.
So is foreign aid just cash, or can foreign aid also include specific help that can't be siphoned off?
You can do more targeted, so the government controls beginning to end. So you send in some people, your own people, and control the progress right through from start to end. So some governments do that, but the tendency within Africa was going to a process called basketing, where a number of governments would put in money and it would go into the central budget of that government to be able to spend, which it's great in principle, but you cannot then keep track of where that money goes and can't hold that government to account for the spending of that.
Why don't they know this is broken, and why don't they fix it? It sounds like you're describing an obvious problem with an obvious solution.
Well, some governments go in, they've got a certain amount of money to spend, and they're not as rigorous over how that money is spent. Whether it's figures of we had 50 people at 100 different events. So that becomes their driving number. Doesn't matter what those people did or the outcomes of that. So that drives some foreign aid. I think our own foreign aid as a nation has been tightened up quite a bit, especially with getting rid of or absorbing AusAid into a Department of Trade and Foreign Affairs. That was a good move because the best aid is opening up free markets, direct investment into the country, opening up the markets, and that will help pull people out of poverty far more than pouring money into a foreign government.
Have you got any specific stories you can share about aid situations that were just really, really wasted, blown opportunities?
A lot of the European countries give into Africa. Obviously, it's a lot closer. We don't give a lot into Africa. But NORAID, the Norwegian arm of development, back in the 80s, they decided to do a big project up in northern Kenya. So it was with the Turkana people. Turkana people are a bit like the Maasai warriors. They're cattle people. But NORAID thought, okay, Lake Turkana had lots of fresh fish, so they thought, let's build a fish factory. So they went ahead, built this fish factory, but Turkana people don't like fish, don't like to touch fish, and so it was a total disaster. They hadn't consulted. All they did was went in, saw what they thought was a good idea, and in principle it was a good idea to have take advantage of fish, get it processed, get it off the market.
Yep.
But the available workers, they wouldn't touch fish or be involved with fish. They're cattle people. That's what they live and breathe. They breathe. And on smaller, aid can be so dangerous, even when you give emergency aid when a disaster has happened. Because you've got, Joe Bloggs, a local farmer, who's produced millet or some other grain, and most of the country is in drought. It's devastated. All of this foreign grain comes into the country, given to the country, and it wipes out poor old the local farmer because it's all free grain coming into the country, destroys the local marketplace. So giving can be quite harmful. Even toothbrushes. There was a campaign for getting people to get toothbrushes. This was in Africa. So they went around, gave toothbrushes to all these kids in a particular area, toothpaste, and toothbrushes don't last that long. So 6 months down the line, the toothbrush is no good anymore, and the kids' teeth start deteriorating. Before they came with the toothbrush, the children used to pull a branch off a particular tree, fluff up the end of the branch, and they would clean their teeth that way. After, they didn't go back to that because it was like they'd stepped up to more of a Western way of doing things and didn't return back to the old trusted, sustainable way of being able to clean their teeth. So what we do in aid can be incredibly damaging. So everything we do has to be with great care.
Wow. What about some examples of aid that went really well, was really well used to make a big difference?
I think in a lot of cases the aid that's used well is going through non-government organisations on the ground in the country. Different organisations that have a specific focus and role, and they understand the culture, they understand the audience they're dealing with, and money going through them is spent far better. It's not wasted because you go into a country, you don't know the prices of things, you'll overpay for wages and all sorts of things. But going through a well-run organisation on the ground, typically you need a Western oversight to make sure it doesn't get siphoned off, because that is always a challenge. I'll talk about Africa, because Africa is where I know. You've got the challenges of any aid that goes in there, the pressure on that individual to help out family members with job, the nepotism, jobs, with siphoning off some of that aid. They're all major concerns. But if you have some good managers in there overseeing it, good expats, then that money can be spent really effectively, accounted for, clean audits, and those, you get some good outcomes. So there's been literacy programs, there's been net programs, HIV type programs that have been successful.
Yep. And how often has there been success in developing the culture to be self-sufficient, to grow even in an increasing level, maybe not completely self-sufficient, but to be more self-sufficient? How malleable are cultures?
Depends. And cultures across Africa, you've got about 2,000 tribal languages just in the Bantus. So it's a massive range of different tribes. And then you've got Nilotic tribes in the northern part of Africa. But the groups we worked with, and our organisation was trying to build sustainability. We were trying to build our African staff to be able to take over certain roles. And certain cultures are more geared to take on particular roles because of the education system or the strong network of relationships. So I found that East Africans were good at the area of literacy, scripture use type work, the partnership type work where you're going out and building up partnership roles. But they struggled more on the translation side. We were able to get some good translators, though. It was just a lot harder to find. So we trained up translators that started off as language helpers with expats, and they worked through and became better and better. We sent them away for different studies and courses, and we had a number that became master's level within linguistics. So they became consultants, language consultants over the period the period I was there. That was 12 years. So they started as language helpers, and over a 12-year period, a couple of these guys became translation consultants, which is a very it's a difficult task to be a consultant because you're asking a lot of questions and you're challenging the individuals that are involved, which can be out of the comfort zone of a lot of Africans.
And so as you would train and educate some of the locals, would there be any kind of separation or distance that would grow between them and the people that weren't receiving education? Was there any kind of resentment that they were becoming too white or anything like that?
Because they weren't going overseas, so that is a major issue in East Africa where I worked, where you'd have Tanzanians or Ugandans heading off to the UK or off to America for some of their formative years, coming back, they obviously get called derogatory names, that they're acting like whites and behaving like whites. But our team members, they were trained within the country and on the skills. So that didn't happen with our team members because they were always still within the community, and they were become seen as key leaders within that language community or tribal area.
I'm aware that countries like Japan used to have a reputation for inferior quality, but they basically sent lots of their students overseas to be educated in British and American schools until they actually reached and matched the level of American and British education and then surpassed it. So it occurs to me that the kind of scorn and ugly names that they can get called for being educated overseas must in itself become a hindrance to the education and the maturing of a culture.
Yeah, exactly. But you'll see that now even in in politics within American politics. You'll see African Americans, and if they don't conform to a particular range of views, particularly left-wing views within that area, they're called as Uncle Toms. They're derogatory names if they don't conform to what is almost prescribed to be.
We have the same thing happening here in Australia with Aboriginals.
Like probably Warren Mundine would cop that a bit because he has more conservative views. So you'll have individuals that really cop it in the middle. Best Price, she copped some horrible abuse from a university that she was meant to speak at, and people around that because she didn't hold what was considered to be the set of values that Aboriginals
and that's the
hold.
real fascism, is you can't have a different idea than what we decide your skin colour must have. You can't think differently if you're a certain identity.
It's a totally racist position to hold, that either an Aboriginal or an African American can't come on the broad range of the spectrum of political life. How insulting is that?
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think the solution is? I mean, it's not practical or even fair to suggest that universities should set up a campus. Let's say Oxford or Cambridge or Sydney Uni shouldn't have to move over to Africa to try and help them. How practical is it to help organisations like yours? I mean, is education locally part of the solution?
Good education is, and surprisingly enough, my wife was doing some courses while we were in Uganda, and it was through Deakin. Deakin had an outlet, Deakin University had an outlet in Kampala. It was, most of it was online. It was the testing side of it. It was based in Kampala. So you do have more and more international universities putting satellite campuses in different countries, which will help in the long run, because Makerere University, which was the main university in Kampala in Uganda, back in the 60s, there was an exchange program between Makerere and Oxford. The standard of the university was so high. It has dropped quite dramatically because it just didn't maintain standards. And
was that political or cultural?
Yeah, cultural issues. Once you kicked out, foreign professors and everything else, and the standard would drop. And South Africa is struggling with that as well. But education will be a key to the future of these countries, and we see it in a number of Asian countries that have really taken off. You've got Singapore; it just goes through the roof. It's really going quite strongly. But a lot of the African countries really struggle because of the amount of corruption and bribery that goes on within that society. And if you don't have a rule of law, you don't have good judicial systems, you don't have free trade and good property ownership, all of those things, it undermines what countries can do.
So what's the solution? How can we best help? What should Australia's policy be looking like? How should we be trying to help developing nations?
I think we always need to have some money that is just there for the emergencies, like the Aceh, the tsunami that wiped out Aceh. That was a generous thing that we did as a nation, but it was the right thing to go in and help those people that were just totally devastated. So we need some of that sort of money for the disasters, and I think the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is heading in the right direction. It's more focusing on investment into the country, free trade. If those countries can trade freely, you take down the barriers to trade and they can get their goods out.
What kind of barriers are there at the moment, commonly?
We just don't have relationships with a lot of the African countries, so there'd be importing barriers, so they wouldn't have some of their customs and exporting type processes sorted out properly. And across Africa, I'm not sure what the number would be for importing into Australia, but there'd be varying levels because they would have varying levels for imports going into the country. So normally it's a bit of a tit for tat. But if we open up that free trade, then you allow that country to grow. But you want to link some of that to really opening up the market. Free trade, economically strong and flexible, where people can start businesses. You want to also have the rule of law. Rule of law and property ownership are two key ones for development.
How do we can't affect rule of law and property ownership though, can we?
We don't have to give to those countries. We can say, look, we will invest, we will help get some industries up and running, but this is what we expect in return. Loans from IMF.
So is that requiring them to lift their game with their domestic legislation?
Yeah, which has been typical over the years for...
is that feasible?
Conditionalities policies.
Yep.
Conditionalities policies on aid has always been part of the aid process.
How high a bar can you set though, demanding a nation change its laws?
Just fixing up, make sure the rule of law is there, that you can't... In Uganda, if I got caught up in a situation, was facing jail, I could buy an outcome. You just pay the judge, you pay certain people around the judge. So if that's the case, then you don't get justice, because it's always the rich guy wins. So there's no justice, a law in principle, and laws in principle, but they can always be bought.
That seems like a very long, slow process to change.
Yeah, it is, but...
It sounds almost more cultural than political.
They've done... when it was a protectorate, Uganda or Tanzania, protectorate in I think Uganda was a protectorate, so it was, you had more oversight. So you've just got to build the strength within the oversight, within the government. And you have government to government, you have the Commonwealth heads, and you can do some things at a government level. And a couple of mates that worked in Tanzania, they were working at high levels in government to try and bring about tax reform, to bring about law reforms and changes to various things. So it can be done. It's a huge task, but it can be done.